Everybody, we're about to get started. This panel is called Coal in Appalachia, Lessons from the Past and Prospects for the Future. Moderating will be Charles DiSalvo from the College of Law.
Thank you, Alice. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you here this afternoon. Our discussion is entitled Coal and Appalachia, Lessons from the Past, Prospects for the Future. We're going to focus on two questions. Question number one, it's the job of the law to regulate the extraction industries. What lessons can we draw from the attempt of the law to regulate the coal industry? So that's question number one. Question number two, coal is fading. A new economy is emerging. Reflecting on the lessons we've learned from our experience with coal, what role must the law play in our future development? So those are the two questions. Here to address them are our five experts. You can read their full biographies in the program. Professor Pat McGinley is the Hayden Professor of Law here at the Law School, a leading environmental law scholar and litigator, and the winner of the Kravchenko Environmental Rights Award in 2016. Professor McGinley will address Mountaintop Removal. John McFerrin, like Professor McGinley, a Duke Law grad, practiced law with the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund of Kentucky and of West Virginia as an environmental litigator. He's a contributing columnist to the Charleston Gazette, and he has very ably edited the newsletter of the West Virginia Highlands Conservancy, The Voice, for the past 16 years. Mike Becher is a former editor with the University of Cincinnati Law Review. He clerked for U.S. District Court Judge Robert Chambers. He was then awarded a very prestigious Equal Justice Fellowship, and as an attorney with Appalachian Mountain Advocates for the last 8 years, he's focused on environmental litigation, particularly with regard to water. And Mike will speak on the effects of the law's effort to regulate water pollution from coal. And I failed to mention, John McFerrin will speak about the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act. Our next speaker is Brandon Dennison, the co-founder and CEO of the Coalfield Development Corporation. He was recently named West Virginian of the Year by West Virginia Living Magazine, which describes coal fields as taking things readily available in Appalachia, like old strip mines, abandoned factories, and out-of-work people, and using them toward a common goal, creating a new economy for West Virginia. Mr. Dennison will talk about the law and that new economy. And last but not least, Ted Boettner, the co-founder and executive director of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. Mr. Boettner and his colleagues have quickly built the center into a major player in debates in West Virginia on state tax and budget issues, economic development, and family economic security. He's taught at WVU, he's taught at the WVU Institute of Technology, and he's been named as one of the most influential business leaders in West Virginia by the State Journal. Mr. Boettner will speak on the natural resources curse. Each speaker has a quarter of an hour, after which we hope to entertain both questions from the audience and cross-panel conversation. So with that, I invite Professor McGinley to make the first presentation.
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chuck. It's good to be here, see so many of our students and folks that I've known for a long time who are interested in and really have lived the experience of the coal fields, and many of you means to people of the coal fields to cherish coal mining jobs and yet suffer from the externalities of coal mining. I think my talk will be a little broader than just mountaintop removal. I just want to set the stage for the discussion that will follow. And let's see if I can figure out how to do this.
You have to put it on slideshow.
I'm sorry?
You have to put it on slideshow.
Well, you can see, my students here know this. Probably not. Okay, slideshow.
It's right.
All right. Now, will this work?
If not, just hit the tab button.
So, I'm really going to talk about the first question. Is it the job of the law to regulate the extractive industries? Really? Who else is going to regulate them? Yeah, well, yes. Well, that's the industry's preference. What lessons can we draw from the attempt of the law to regulate the coal industry? Good word, attempt. Regulation of the adverse impacts of coal mining in Appalachia has had its positive impacts, and yet there's still much to do. Surface Mining Control Reclamation Act that John McFerrin will be talking about. I wanted to focus on a couple of congressional findings. You know, why the Federal Surface Mining Act was passed. I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly. And you can just take a look, quick look. I'm not going to read them.
Like a mirror. That's right.
These are the impacts that Congress found of irresponsible coal mining. At the time, the Federal Surface Mining Reclamation Act was passed in 1977 after a 10-year battle in Congress and from the grassroots up to do something about the extraordinarily adverse impacts of coal mining, not only strip mining, but underground mining as well. The statute sets up a cooperative federalism model in which the states can take over responsibility for enforcing the federal act if they show that they've got the wherewithal, laws and regulations that are as stringent as the federal law and regulations, and that they've got the funding and staffing to carry out that responsibility. I wanted to talk about a couple of particular provisions of the act, and one is the bonding requirement, which basically was a common sense regulatory mandate that every coal mine operator who wanted to get a permit under SMCRA to conduct underground or surface mining operations would have to post a reclamation bond. And the reclamation bond was to be in the amount it would cost for the regulatory agency to reclaim the land if the coal company who had the permit went bankrupt. Why was that provision there? Because there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of coal companies from the beginning of the 20th century that mined coal and left lands ravaged, water pollution, soil erosion, sedimentation, landslides, flooding, and so forth. And so the idea was that coal companies would cost out what reclamation would involve, put a dollar value on it, give that to the regulatory agency, and the regulatory agency in West Virginia, it's the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, would also do the same thing, and they would set a bond that would cover the full cost of reclamation, including water pollution, on every coal mine. The idea would be that unlike the past history of thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of acres of mine lands going unreclaimed with pollution, flowing from them and the adverse economic impacts of unreclaimed mine, that would never happen again, because there will always be money available to reclaim mine lands. And with regard to mountaintop removal mining, which was a new mining technique that the coal industry argued in the halls of Congress should be permitted because it would create level land that could be used for economic development in the coal fields, something that's sorely missing in the mountains of southern West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia. And so the provisions of the Act provide an exception to the rule that every mine had to be reclaimed to its approximate original contour. And the reason for that was that Congress saw level land created by mountaintop removal mining, as the industry promised, as a source of sustainable future economic development. So that, in this provision of SMECRA 515, it provided for a variance from the approximate original contour requirement. And as you can see, it said in cases where industrial, commercial, agricultural, residential, or public facility is proposed as a post-mine land use, then the coal operator did not have to reclaim the land to its approximate original contour. Great, wonderful. What's the reality? Didn't happen. Lost opportunity, basically because of regulatory agencies and politicians' closeness to the industry. That provision was not enforced. Well, tens of thousands of acres of land, predominantly in southern West Virginia, were mined using the mountaintop removal mining method, which blasts off the ridge tops and sometimes removes as many as 15 or 18 coal seams. And the waste from those mines is dumped into headwater streams in southern Appalachia, in central Appalachia. So this is what the coal operator had to show in order to get a permit, and it never happened. Basically, I was involved with Professor Weiss and lawyers from the Appalachian Mountain Advocates in the first mountaintop removal case where we challenged the state permitting of mountaintop removal mines. And all these requirements were there but never enforced. In fact, many of the mines, the majority of the mines were permitted as if they would reclaim to approximate original contour. It was a scam. It was a ruse. And so congressional findings about the externalities of coal mining, there's a lot of them. And instead of talking about them, let's just take a look at photographs. Well, that's an unreclaimed mountaintop removal site. It certainly shows you the extent to which the ridge tops are impacted, what little soil that is available is impacted, the vegetation is stripped, enormous consequences, even with the extent of reclamation that coal companies did, which itself did not meet the requirements, generally the requirements of the Federal Surface Mine Act. Flooding. This is an example of a valley fill mountaintop removal mine. I don't know if I don't have a laser here, but there's a little dark spot at the top of the face there. That's a huge earth-moving equipment. The tires are about 11, 12 feet high. So to give you some proportion. And throughout Appalachia, over 1,000 miles, I can't remember exactly, you can probably tell us the number of miles of headwater streams in West Virginia and surrounding states were buried. And I mentioned two things, bonding and mountaintop removal, to make a point. The regulation of the environmental impacts of coal mining has improved reclamation. It has prevented some pollution. But the problem has been, for the last 40 years, I can tell you, because I've been involved in coal industry issues since before I came here as a professor in 1975. I was an enforcement lawyer for the Attorney General in Pennsylvania. So, bonding, never adequate, never adequate. We had to sue in 2001, that was the Appalachian lawyers, Professor Weiss, myself, trial lawyers for public justice. And in a decision by Judge Hayden, late Charles Hayden, in this case, West Virginia Highlands Conservancy versus Norton, he said the following about the long delay in the Federal Office of Surface Mining's efforts to bring the West Virginia bonding requirements into compliance with federal law. You know, basically what was happening is what Judge Hayden identified here. For 10 years, the West Virginia Regulatory Agency has said to DEP, your bonding is inadequate, there's not enough money to reclaim, there are thousands of acres going unreclaimed with the attendant water pollution and other externalities. And DEP did nothing, and OSM did nothing. And this is what Judge Hayden said. Thousands of acres unreclaimed, of unreclaimed strip mined land, untreated polluted water, millions, potentially billions of dollars of state liabilities. That created a climate of lawlessness. This is a federal judge who's a Republican. He was appointed by a Republican president. And he's reviewing the effectiveness of the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection to enforce the federal SMACRA. A climate of lawlessness which creates a pervasive impression that continued disregard for federal law and statutory requirements goes unpunished or possibly unnoticed. And that wasn't all. He said agency warnings have no more effect than a wink and a nod. A deadline is just an arbitrary date on the calendar once passed, not to be mentioned again, for 10 years. And he wasn't finished. He pointed fingers on those who were also responsible. Financial benefits accrue to the owners and operators of coal mines who are not required to incur the statutory burden and costs attendant to surface mining. Political benefits accrue to the state executive, the governor, and legislators who escape accountability while the mining industry gets a free pass. Why should the state regulators do otherwise when the federal overseers remain toothless and without effect? So what's the point here? Yes, the law improved coal mining. It prevented some pollution. It protected some coal field communities, but it hasn't been enough. In fact, in 2010, coal industry managers, the top people in biggest coal companies, saw the price of coal skyrocketing. And what did they do? Well, they wanted to cash in. So they invested in buying more coal reserves, buying other coal companies with the idea that there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And what happened? It wasn't the so-called Obama's war on coal. It was shale gas competition that brought the price of coal plummeting. The major coal companies had borrowed billions of dollars to acquire these new coal properties, and they couldn't service their debt. 5 of them, including Peabody Coal Company. If you recall John Prine's song, Mr. Peabody's Coal Train. Well, Mr. Peabody's coal train went over a cliff. And all of those companies in bankruptcy, and they left literally hundreds of millions of dollars of reclamation because there weren't adequate bonds, and probably more than $1 billion of reclamation left. So there's a lot of responsibility to go around with regard to coal mining regulation and its effectiveness. I'm still waiting to see really effective regulation. We have the legislature has a bill now called, what is it, the Dead Possum Bill?
There's several.
And the legislature's, you don't have enough coal industry here. Let's give you some more.
The tax credit, that passed yesterday, I believe.
So, deja vu all over. Thanks.
Thank you, Pat. John McFerrin.
Well, I need to talk a little bit about the history of the Surface Mine Act and how we got here. Now, the times when the Surface Act was being passed were very exciting times. In the rest of the country, the word abolitionist had disappeared, because we thought that was a bunch of Quakers and fellow travelers who were there to abolish slavery. We thought that was over. In West Virginia, people were still talking abolitionist up into the 60s and 70s, because it was to abolish strip mines. And like all good movies, it had its songs. We had You Can't Put It Back. And there was a song, there was a dialogue between two people about how we would resist. It was, 2 lines were, we'll blow the big dozers with hot lead and powder. That was the kind of atmosphere that existed. And all that stuff produced some results. Oh, forgot about the widow cones. And there wasn't anybody who was around in West Virginia at that time who hasn't seen the poster of the widow Combs being hauled off to jail because she lay down in front of a bulldozer. I mean, Pat's probably still got his. But that was what was happening. Now, all that stuff produced a lot of state action. Like West Virginia passed its strip mine bill in 1967. Then Governor Hewlett Smith gave a very rousing speech about how bad strip mining was. And the legislature responded with a bill regulating it. Kentucky did the same thing about the same time. We finally got to the Surface Mining Act, passed by Congress in 1967.
77.
I'm sorry, 77. Ken Heckler had introduced a bill banning surface mining in 1971. Jay Rockefeller ran in 1972 on a platform to abolish surface mining. We finally got the Federal Act. And at the Federal Act, they had, just like all acts, or many, you have a rose garden ceremony. People come and, the people who fought for this act get to come and sit around and watch it be signed. There were a lot of people in West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky who refused to go. They wouldn't go because it was a compromise. They had spent their lives fighting to abolish strip mining. They had not spent their lives fighting to have it regulated. And to those people, it was like saying, well, slavery would be okay if we just put hot and cold water in the cabins and gave them Sundays off. They weren't there to legitimize strip mining. They were there to have it banned, so they wouldn't go. But it was a compromise. President Carter even said in his remarks at the signing, it was a compromise. Now we have to look 40 years later. How good's the deal? How good? What did it accomplish? What did it not? Now we had, before the act even passed, we had West Virginia's act. West Virginia's act had a lot of the same stuff that the federal act had in it. What it lacked attitude. The West Virginia Act is chock full of weasel words. It's all in the director's discretion, and if the director thinks this is okay, and things like that. So you really wouldn't have to enforce it if you didn't really want to, because the director could waive everything. But there was enforcement going on. What the federal act did is it made a lot of things that had been discretionary mandatory. And it brought attitude. I'm not going to remember, when we got the federal act, it was like in those movies where you see the cavalry coming around the hill. We had all these federal inspectors, and if the state wouldn't do anything, the federal inspectors would. Now, that attitude has sort of gone away by the Office of Surface Mining. But at that time, the federal inspectors were people who were going to come in here, and they thought the state is not regulating this, and we're going to do it. If there's one example I can give of how the law changed, this federal law can be summed up in really two words: offsite damage. The way the act works, you draw a line on a map, everything inside that line is your permit. That permit is a license to destroy. You have to put it back when you're finished, but during the permit, that is your license to destroy. It's like James Bond had his license to kill. You've got your license to destroy. The state act says you must take reasonable measures not to cause any offsite damage. The federal act says you don't cause any offsite damage, period. That's the difference. The federal act's written by people who did not trust the coal industry for very good historical reasons, but they didn't. And the state, the federal act was supposed to fix all that. The other thing it brought was it brought public involvement. Now, permits are advertised in advance. You have to put a notice in the paper that you're applying. People ask for a public hearing. And you can ask for an inspection. You can say, I think there's a violation going on, and the inspector has to go inspect, and you get a chance to go with the inspector. It also brought citizen suits. But if you think the state is not enforcing the law, you can file suit to get it enforced. And the other feature of that is you can recover your attorney fees. Now, you might think that attorneys are heartless mercenaries who don't care anything about except making the next boat payment. But whether you're a heartless mercenary or a good guy or good woman who just wants to do the right thing to still make a living, the truth of the matter is there's a lot of enforcement has gone on because the statutory attorney fees are there. So that's what we got. We got a little bit of law, a little better attitude, a little attitude where the protections of the act cannot be just waived willy-nilly. And I think they can be waived politically. I mean, the stories I've heard are all apocryphal, but you hear enough stories that you think it must be true that the common response to a citation or the inspector coming to visit is to call the governor's office and see if we can't work this out. So if you have that kind of political influence, you can't get perfect enforcement. But we did do some things. So the thing you have to do, you can do, now that it's been 40 years, is you look at what the deal was. What the people got, we got a little better enforcement, we got statutory attorney fees, we got public involvement. But what we gave up is we gave up mountaintop removal. That's really what it cost us, to have these marginal benefits to the law. If you look back, it seems like it maybe wasn't such a terrible deal, because at the time, strip mines were just these, by our standards, little bitty things. Like, we look back and we think, 100 acres. Oh, so what, 100 acres? Because we live in the time of mountaintop removal. When mountaintop removal, it's 1,000 acres. Permits are 1,000 acres, and they get 10 or 12 of those same permits, and the sites end up being 10,000 acres. And so, if you're living in a time as they were in 1977, it's not such a bad thing to give up, to take this compromise law, and you get some better enforcement, and you get some public participation. And what you have to give up is you have to put up with these little tiny, by today's standards, little tiny mines, 100 acres at a time. But what we didn't realize is the same act that gave us those little benefits, better enforcement, some public participation, they also gave us mountaintop removal. And now, we've got 1 million acres affected by surface mines. We've got entire ecosystems disrupted. We've got just alterations of terrain on a scale that nobody in history has ever seen. I mean, that's what's going on right here in our state. And if we look back on it and we look at the deal, we were offered a little, if we were put up with some surface mining, we would get these benefits of better enforcement and some public participation. That doesn't sound like a bad deal. But what we got mountaintop removal mining. And now it looks like the people who said, don't do this, don't sign this act, who wouldn't go to the rose-colored ceremony, were absolutely right. If we knew then what we know now, we would have said, just crush this egg before it hatches, because it's evil. Now, looking back, I can sort of look at the act and see if it worked. And it really didn't. There were two big ideas in the act that turned out not to be true. The first big idea is mining was supposed to be a temporary land use. It's like a pimple on a teenager's forehead. It pops up, it's really ugly, it's OMG, OMG, OMG. But in a few days, it's gone. Strip mining was supposed to be that. It was supposed to be, we have this little temporary land use. It's ugly, ugly as sin, but, a little while, it'll be reclaimed, it'll be back to its old self, and we can just go forward. Well, that doesn't happen. That never happened. Partly it didn't happen because the enforcement wasn't good enough. Maybe if we'd had better enforcement, it would have worked better. But, we have mines right now that were mined in the 70s, and they're still leaking acid. And the post-mining land use is treating the acid from those mines. That's what's happened at that land. Those are the central part of the state where the acid seams mostly are. There are places in the southern part of the state where supposedly reclaimed strip mines are still leaking toxic materials. So we didn't get that. We did not get a temporary land use because they're not temporary. They're the gift that keeps on giving. The other thing that we were supposed to get is flat land. And, Pat talked about flat land. Some of the arguments at the time were, if we just had flat land. You talk to some economic development people, particularly from southern counties, and they talk about, oh, if we had flat land, their companies just lined up at the state line. If we just had some flat land, they would pour in here, and the world would be better. It'd be great. But the truth of it is, it's not. And we have 1 million acres, 3 to 5% has an industrial use. It's not turning into flat land. Or it's not turning into flat land, it's just not turning into this economic bonanza that we would have. If you want an example of the barriers to flat land, or the barriers to actually making this, there's 12,000 acres site just south of Charleston. It's in Lincoln and Boone County. And you could put, you look at it, you think you could put in several New England states up there. But it's 12,000 acres. There's a interstate highway that goes right beside it. There's a railroad spur that goes there. There's no factories that want to move there. And if you can't you can't get factories to move to this 10,000 acre site with a 4-lane highway and a railroad running to it, you're not going to get factories to move to Blair, which, if you don't know, Blair is out there. I mean, it's way out there. And so, in retrospect, I don't think the deal was worth it.
Thank you, Chad. Mike Becher.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'll begin by saying I am one of those mercenary attorneys that's made my living for the last 8 years off of attorney's fees from various environmental statutes. And I'm also happy to say I was able to take my kayak out of layaway last summer. So, very excited. Picking up on some of the themes that John and Pat had talked about, I've spent the last 8 years largely litigating under the Clean Water Act, as well as SMACRA a bit. And one of the themes that I'm going to hit on over and over throughout this talk, based on that experience, is really the attempt to avoid regulation. And I think that's one of the things that has been a real challenge to controlling water pollution, to controlling the SMACRA issues that were talked about previously with the coal industry. And I really think that's the key to getting a handle on effects from oil and gas. There needs to be a political will to make sure that we're protecting things like our environment, like our rivers and streams. And there needs to be foresight and thought that those things are important. A lot of the work that I've done that I'm proud of is under the Clean Water Act. I would argue that the Clean Water Act is probably the most useful environmental statute when it comes to controlling pollution generally. And the oil and gas industry has been able to extract itself from much of the regulation under the Clean Water Act. So I know it's an optimistic thing, but we've had a lot of trouble with regulating water pollution from coal, even with a really powerful statute. It's going to be even harder with oil and gas because we don't have that statute applying. And it's going to take a lot of attention and a lot of work politically to make sure we learn our lessons from coal. I want to start with the state of the waters in West Virginia. This map was taken from the 2010 303D list. That's a list that states are required to develop each year, well, every 2 years, of streams that are not meeting the purposes they're supposed to under the Clean Water Act. As you can see, there's a lot of red streams in West Virginia. There's a lot of streams that aren't meeting their intended uses. Out of DEP's assessed stream miles, which is about 32,000 streams in West Virginia, over 11,000 are unable to support aquatic life, which is one of the core goals of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was passed by Congress, was set out with a congressional purpose that every water be fishable and swimmable. 11,000, or over 1/3 of our waters, are not properly fishable and not meeting that congressional goal. This really actually surprised me.
Question.
Sure.
Is that a map of 32,000 miles of stream, or is that just a map of 11,000 or 9,000? Or?
These are all the streams that are not meeting one or more
And what
designated
figure would
uses.
you apply to those?
I'd say it's probably on the order of at least obviously 11,000 up to probably about 15,000.
Okay.
And is that your follow-up, is that directly attributed to the coal production?
This is not all coal. This is everything. However, you will see in mining hotspots in the southern part of West Virginia, Kanawha County is about here, and the northern coal fields are centering up here. We're certainly seeing a lot of pollution issues from coal, and I'll get into specifically some of the pollutants and pollution challenges from coal that are causing this effect. The first one I want to talk about is a lot of the pre-law or pre-SMACRA damages that were one of the reasons for the passage of the act. And that's acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage, the stream that I showed at the beginning, the title slide that was bright orange, that was also the pollutants that make up acid mine drainage that were causing the discoloration of that stream. I promise I won't get into a lot of chemistry in this talk, but I think it's important to realize when we're talking about mining pollution that just because mines are discharging things that are coming from the earth that are brought up naturally, it doesn't mean they're not harmful, it doesn't mean they're not toxic. And acid mine drainage is a perfect example of that. The material that causes both the orange staining and also the acid, where acid mine drainage comes from, is pyrite. It's the same compound that makes up fool's gold. And that's made of iron and sulfur. When it gets exposed to water, the iron and sulfur oxidize. They form compounds with the water and form iron oxides, which is this red material you can see along the stream. It also called sulfuric acid. And that sulfuric acid can be so strong that there are streams in West Virginia that run at pHs of around 3. That's on par with stomach acid for how acidic they are. And nothing can live in a stream like that. The iron itself causes huge discoloration and aesthetic problems with rivers and streams. And the acidity can just kill every living thing in the stream. So acid mine drainage was one of the first major recognized water pollution problems from coal mining. And again, it was one of the major impetuses for the 1977 SMACRA. It's still a major problem. Despite the fact that SMACRA had a component that they're not supposed to be permitting mines that have the potential to run into acidic materials, that pyrite, and cause acid mine drainage, we've got hundreds of sites over West Virginia that were operating post-SMACRA that still have those problems. The Special Reclamation Program, this ties into the bonding that Pat was talking about. The Special Reclamation Program is the state program that's designed to clean up sites when mine operators go bankrupt and aren't able to fulfill their reclamation obligations. That program wasn't in place till 1977, only covers mines that were regulated under SMACRA. They have approximately 180 sites across the state that are still treating just for acid mine drainage problems. In addition, so they don't lose their bonds, there are still at least 100 mines in West Virginia that are still operating and cannot get their bonds back because they're still treating acid mine drainage problems on streams discharged or streams flowing through their mine. So this is something that we've been facing for 30 plus years, 40 years. We still don't have a good handle on it. Then we've got a bunch of new challenges that have come up with mountaintop removal in waters. And there has been a tremendous political pressure to protect the coal industry from regulations that would infringe upon mountaintop removal mining. This actually is very similar to the picture that Pat had in his slide. This is a large valley fill where coal mining refuse is literally just dumped in the valleys next to the coal mines. If you hiked in West Virginia, you know that nearly every valley has a stream running up through it. This valley fill is covering up a stream. So one of the first challenges that Appalachian mountain advocates ever brought was based on my boss, Joe Lovett, just paging through the Federal Register back in the late 90s and finding this federal rule that said you couldn't dump mining waste within 100 meters of a stream. Well, seems obvious they're doing that. Let's challenge it. Brought an action for an injunction in front of Charles Hayden in the Southern District of West Virginia, won in front of Charles Hayden. The very next day, Senator Robert Byrd did a lot of great things for West Virginia, was definitely a friend of coal. Robert Byrd was in the Senate the very next day calling for congressional legislation to overturn that finding and to allow this practice despite the plain reading of the rule, which would not have allowed that to occur. This still happens. The rule is still in place, but it's basically been made not subject to challenge by some legal technicalities through the court system. And it's a prime example of the difficulties we face. Even when there's a straightforward rule that says you can't do this, it hasn't always been enough to stop it. One of the challenges, the first challenges that I worked on, was on a toxic pollutant that comes from coal mines, selenium. This pollutant was found to actually be deforming fish in the Mud River Basin. These are bluegill fry, baby bluegill, which have spinal deformations as a result of selenium toxicity. One of the attorneys at Appalachian Advocates, Derek Teeney, basically dedicated 3 or 4 years of his life to trying to stop or limit selenium pollution in mines around the Mud River Basin. His first action was to file in front of the state regulatory agency. That resulted in the state agency basically staying the limits on selenium for 71 permits. They basically said, okay, we realize that these permits have limits, have things you can do to stop the discharge of selenium. We're going to put that all off for 3 years. By some, again, creative research and creative use of the Clean Water Act, he was able to find one mine that had not gone through the appropriate permitting process. It hadn't been properly subject to public notice. And so the changes that the regulatory agency tried to put in to delay the effectiveness of selenium regulation were actually struck down by a federal court because it was not subject to the proper procedures. And that was the hook in to regulating selenium. Since then, we've had probably 24 cases, scores of permit challenges to get selenium regulated and to stop effects like we're seeing on these fish. The response to that has been action by the legislature. I don't want to read this whole slide, but shortly after we began those challenges, within a couple years, the coal industry had their lobbyists in the legislature, and they passed an amendment to the state code that said the alleged environmental impacts that were documented in federal research don't happen here in West Virginia, obviously ignoring the effects to our fish, but trying to limit the ability to bring challenges in state and federal court for the kinds of problems that selenium was having. Another challenge, this is something that we're working on hard today, is ionic toxicity. As it happens with acid mine drainage, when you've got that material pyrite that's being weathered and oxidized in the contact of water, there's literally dozens of other small trace elements and chemicals that are doing the same thing. They're being mobilized because they were buried for literally millions of years beneath the earth. They're brought up and being exposed to weather and rain for the first time and literally dissolving. And that dissolution is causing a lot of these trace elements and materials to run off of these mine sites. In a small setting, that may not be a problem. In the, as John said, 100-acre, 150-acre mine sites, that's going to be a limited amount of material. In mine sites like this is the Fola Mine Complex, which straddles the Clay County, Nicholas County border. This mine site's about 15,000 acres in area. To give you some sense of scale, this is the town of Summersville off to the side. So Summersville is about 1/5 the size. If you zoom out actually and take a look at this in relation to Charleston, West Virginia, there's as much disturbance on this mine as in the Charleston metro area. When you've got that scale of destruction, and you've got all this material running off these mine sites, it actually makes the water too salty for stream organisms to live.
One operator, one.
That's actually two different operators and probably dozens of permits. They tend to permit once, one at a time. Now they're permitting on the range of 1,000 to 1,200 acres. Cumulatively, when you get a few dozen of them in the same complex, they get that large. So we were enforcing these by trying to enforce water quality standards of the Clean Water Act. And lo and behold, we soon faced another legislative challenge, basically eliminating our ability, or trying to eliminate our ability to enforce water quality standards. One of the ways we know that these are harming the waters is that they can kill the most sensitive organisms in the stream, the bugs, which form the basis for life in the streams. They're what fish feed on, what terrestrial organisms feed on. They're really useful because they don't move out of an area quickly. The legislature also tried to take away that avenue by changing the way that streams were assessed and measured. I think 48 states use bugs for their assessments. Our state legislature last year directed the DEP to look primarily at fish populations. So again and again, we have seen challenges based on the Clean Water Act, challenges with good legal foundation. The political agencies have tried, or the legislature itself have tried to pull out from under our feet. And I think that's a real challenge again going forward, is that we're going to have to recognize that it's the people of West Virginia, the voters of West Virginia, that need to pay attention, care about these problems, and make sure that regulation by the agencies and the legislature is current, or we're going to face these same issues with gas.
Thank you, Mike. Brandon Dennison.
So I'm with Coalfield Development, and I think, let's see here. Yeah. And so our role at Coalfield, I'm most definitely not a lawyer. It's community economic development, so trying to illustrate what a more vibrant, diversified, healthy economy could look like in southern West Virginia, trying to pioneer some of those different business models. So that's kind of our contribution to the discussion. So really happy to be here. That's our catchphrase, rebuilding the Appalachian economy from the ground up, so very much bottom up. And I'm going to show how we do that. What we mean by that catchphrase is not from the top down. So, I mean, I think there are some important policies that can help us do what we do that I'm going to get to at the end of the slide. But really trying to be entrepreneurial and scrappy and use what we have at our disposal to do what we can. We all know the need. So at Coalfield Development, we hire unemployed people to, many of them laid off coal miners. All of them coming, out of unemployment or low income or off of public assistance. So we're missional in who we choose to hire, and they staff our social enterprises. So we are organized as a family of 5 social enterprises. I'm going to talk more about those in a little bit. And the enterprises are often different sectors of the economy, so they feel kind of disconnected, except that they all share the same vision, mission, and values, and they all utilize this 33, 6, and 3 model. So we hire unemployed people, and they work 33 hours a week for our enterprises, just like they would for any other company. So that's really important. We're a direct job creator. That's what makes us different from a lot of other workforce development programs. And then 6 hours a week, our trainees are in the community college classroom working towards an associate's degree in applied science. And 3 hours a week, we do personal development. And we do that together, everyone on staff and all of our crew members. Things that all of us as human beings need to continually be thinking about, how we communicate, how we focus, how we problem solve, are we achieving our goals, are we mentally, emotionally, physically healthy, so forth and so on. It's a 2.5-year contract, so it's really a long-term, deep, one person at a time commitment. So that's what, bottom up looks like, whereas a lot of the government programs are really trying to certify hundreds of people, but then you get, for a real world example, a situation where 200 laid off coal miners are certified HVAC technicians in a county with a population of 20,000 people, so it really doesn't do much good. Whereas an associate's degree that's an earned credential that can go with that individual for the rest of their life. Every 2 weeks, we do a professional evaluation, so we really try and check and monitor that we're achieving workforce development goals. And once a month, we do a personal check-in. And so we organize this in these 4 quadrants. Our first 6 professional criteria are mandatory for employment. So you've got to be on time, you've got to be safe, you've got to have a good attitude. The other 6 are how you can become excellent at what you do, how you can really become a leader, take initiative, be a problem solver, good communicator. For personal themes, it starts with care for self. And this is a struggle in Appalachia. I thought the lunch speech today was really good, captured the Appalachian culture, but sometimes, we have our crew members are the only person in their whole extended family working, and that's a lot of pressure, and so we kind of have to emphasize it's really important you take care of yourself and your family first, or else we see a lot of people kind of get pulled back down into the muck sometimes. And that leads to care for others, so it's take care of yourself, but it's not all about you. And it culminates with citizenship. So what we're really trying to cultivate in our crew members, certainly successful employees, hopefully even entrepreneurs, but really active, engaged, and educated citizens, which is the most valuable thing we could do for Southern West Virginia. We've had some pretty good traction, over 100 new jobs, 6 new businesses. I mean, we have our numbers, but we've gotten some pretty good traction. We started in 2010, very, very small, just a crew of 3, all formerly unemployed. And since then, we've had over 30 graduates so far. They're all working full-time right now. We've got 55 on our payroll right now. There's our first crew signing their contract. So social enterprise, is that a concept folks are familiar with? Just by show of hands, social enterprise or social entrepreneurship? Okay. So social enterprise is a business model that really takes the compassion of a charitable mission. We are a 501c3 charitable organization, but it blends that compassionate mission with the efficiency of the business world. So the hope is, instead of just trying to go beg for grants and donations the rest of our lives, we set up actually successful businesses that generate revenue that's self-sustaining, so that the grants can be helpful in an investment, but we're not totally dependent on the whims of Congress for our survival. So our first kind of creative social enterprise was in deconstruction. We got all this out-migration, we got all these empty buildings, and the usual model is a town, small town, tries to get a grant, hires a couple guys with a bulldozer to knock down 3 or 4, and it all goes in a landfill. Well, these are dilapidated structures. They do need to come down. They're health and safety hazards, but they've got incredible old-growth timber in them. They've got, antique windows. These were built in the 1900s with real, aesthetic architectural value, and so it's a shame to see them wasted. So our model of deconstruction actually creates more jobs because it takes more hands to take it apart surgically. And it created a new market. It can resell, reuse, recycle the materials. Our biggest buyer is in New York City, believe it or not. He does high-end bar and restaurant renovations. The more nicked up and beat up the wood is, the better. So, interior design is a strange industry. We just sell it, we don't ask. So our mission is courage, creativity, and community. So to inspire courage, inspire the courage to be, to maybe do things a little bit differently, how we have in the past. To activate creativity. So our philosophy is very much that we in Appalachia have it within ourselves to achieve our full potential. We're not trying to change Appalachia into something that it's not. We're really just trying to activate the true Appalachian spirit that maybe has fallen asleep in some instances. And then we want to cultivate community. So, we have all this talk about jobs, but it's really much more complex than that. Just giving a person a minimum wage job and then dusting your hands off and saying you've succeeded is really a disservice. What we need to do is cultivate opportunities. So jobs, yes, but better paying jobs, and education and training and mentorship and support. That's what cultivating an opportunity looks like to us. So we're organized as a family of social enterprises. It's a little bit dated, but this is still the gist. 5 social enterprises. The top one is real estate. We don't treat that as an enterprise anymore. Just real estate development is a core competency of Coalfield Development at the umbrella level. It's the service we provide to all of our enterprises. So focus on the bottom 5. Revitalize Appalachia's sustainable construction, some call it green collar construction. One of the most sustainable things you can do for a town is save the existing structures, especially the historic buildings. Ton of embodied energy in those buildings. They're beautiful, the community cares about them, and there is economic potential in them if you can reinvest and make them safe and healthy and beautiful again. Reclaim Appalachia does mine land reclamation and also our deconstruction program. Refresh Appalachia's sustainable agriculture. Rewire is solar and energy efficiency, and Rediscover is arts and culture. So we didn't pick these sectors out of the blue. A lot of really smart people have done a lot of thinking about what sectors of the economy have real potential in Central Appalachia, and so we've just listened to that research. There's like a group called Central Appalachian Network, Appalachian Funders Network, a lot of work to think about what has economic potential, and so we've trusted that, and it's played out pretty well so far. So just a little deeper on the enterprises. Rediscover is arts and culture. That includes, we have a wood shop. You can see down here some of our employees there. We have a community coffee shop in the town of Wayne. And then we have this old factory building in Huntington, which is going to have an artist studio space and a community theater. This is, I'm not looking to pick a fight with the Marshall thing, but what's neat, because I know where I am right now. However, some of the skyboxes in Marshall, that's the mini bar, and our wood shop crew got to make that product. So, that's something that our crew can be very, very proud of. And, they meet someone and say, did you go to the game? Did you see the mini bar and the skyboxes? I made that. So really, I think what we're doing in a lot of ways is building pride for our crew members. And then this is the Mills Group here in Morgantown, actually has some of our reclaimed wood products as well. Refresh is all about sustainable agriculture. A lot of you probably know Ben Gilmer. He's a WVU grad, just does a phenomenal job with Refresh Appalachia. And some of that happens on former Mountaintop Removal sites, actually, which is pretty amazing. For example, 22 Mine, this is down in Mingo County near the Mingo-Logan border. So the earth after Mountaintop Removal process clearly is very, very compacted. And so to make it good for agriculture, again, we start with the goats, which picket the shrubbery. And we bring the, let's see, what comes after the goats? Come the chickens, which peck at the ground, scratch it all up. And then come the pigs, which really root around and tear up the root systems. Of course, all these animals are pooping the whole time. That's building the soil base back up. It's really pretty amazing. It's kind of like a redemptive process, honestly. And then there's some high tunnel activities that goes on. We want to do some solar activity, although there's some regulatory barriers to that we'll get into. And it's all really pretty amazing. Reclaim is training people to actually do reclamation, but in a more sustainable and eco-friendly manner. And then we also have done, so this is a timber frame house we built from our construction crew. Providing some housing that's up out of the floodplain is something that could be valuable in southern West Virginia, considering all the flooding. It's just some pictures of our crew in action. This is a revitalization project in the town of Wayne, the old 5 and Dime. This is our solar crew in action. Our solar crew also does lighting upgrades. So for commercial customers, there's huge carbon consequences actually to, these are 100,000 square foot buildings that you're making way more efficient, and they're saving a ton on their energy bills, so you can do some creative on-bill financing. It's always, we always, a lot of times our solar install is the first of its kind in a town, so it really generates a lot of conversation, which is pretty cool, because it's very visible. This is just an example of a revitalization project, take an old empty building. We do a ton of community engagement to envision what could be useful, what could be viable, what could work in this building. So that's where the idea for the coffee shop, everyone said there's nowhere to really get a cup of coffee, sit down, have a business meeting, meet with old friends. So we simply responded to that, and it pays for itself. It almost pays for itself. So, and this is what it's all about. So all of our crew members are almost always the first in their family to not just to earn a degree of higher education, but to even try to enroll to get a degree of higher education. So I love this picture because you have the children there, and so the hope and what I think we're seeing happen is this is the slow turnaround and reversal of a poverty cycle, to go from generations of not seeing a mommy or a daddy get up and go to work to now a mommy and daddy who's a lifelong learner, just earned a degree, is starting a great career. That's a powerful and hopeful message. So our vision statement is Appalachian places and people unlocking their full potential and power and purpose. So just to wrap up, again, we're not necessarily a policy organization, but there's lots of policies that touch us. The first I'll hit on housing, actually. It's kind of easily overlooked, but really important, especially at the state level, a lot of housing policy. Right now they're kind of getting ready to eliminate the West Virginia Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is scary. Workers' comp is something that I think there could be some policy innovation there. We get creamed on workers' comp. We get treated just like any other contractor, any other farm business, and sometimes worse so because of our job training goals. So we could use some help there. The Community Technical College bill will touch us, obviously. On solar, right now in West Virginia, you don't have the ability to compete with the utilities. You can't sell solar. You can power your own home with solar, but you really can't sell, if you have excess power, you really can't sell it. We have a monopoly system, and we're really the last state of our border states that still has that arcane and just completely stupid system. So that would be good to work on. And then at the federal level, there's this power initiative. Everybody familiar with the power initiative, maybe? A lot of energy. That stands for Partnerships and Opportunities in Workforce and Economic Revitalization. It's a federal Obama initiative that still kind of quietly lives on. And I think it's actually been pretty effective. And the Appalachian Regional Commission, ARC in general, it's a unique approach to federal-state partnership in government that I actually think works pretty well compared to other agencies. And then the AML, there's some AML pilot program, and the Reclaim Act, which is a hot-button issue right now that could have huge consequences, provide major reinvestment for Central Appalachia. It needs to be an advocacy priority for all of us. And I think the last thing I'll say on policy, some of these discretionary programs that get cut so much for budgetary reasons, it makes no sense. A $5 million discretionary program is not what's breaking the bank of our federal budget. It's the mandatory programs, Medicare, Social Security, defense spending, are what are busting the budget at the federal level. So it's so silly to squabble over these pennies that actually have really important impacts for communities and keep ignoring the real problem. So we can talk more later in the Q&A about the policy component. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Ed Bettner.
All right. Well, Brandon gets to be all happy. I get to be all disappointed. I'm just kidding. Chuck, do you know which one it is up here?
No, I don't actually.
Not that one.
Okay, Melissa, come on up and fix this for us. That's not it.
Do one of these.
The right corner.
Is someone on the right side of the screen?
Oh yeah, here we go. That's good. Melissa, I think we got it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's not it.
Give Melissa a cut back. There'll be a panel discussion following this one on lawyers and technology.
Yeah, okay. Will you do that then? I was gonna get haunted. Sorry about that. You had it on yours, okay. Yeah, well, it's 3 from yours. Did it? Okay, very good. Let the doom and gloom begin. All right, so as Chuck talked about earlier, what I would like to discuss a little bit is about the resource curse in West Virginia and talk, it's a big hot topic. And it's something at the Center of Budget and Policy we've looked at since our founding about 10 years ago. I never went into the job on policy and research, especially for low-income families, to really focus on the energy economy so much, but we end up doing a lot of work on it because of that. And because it's just this huge factor in West Virginia. If you see West Virginia's GDP grow, you always see its mining grow. They grow in tandem. So it's a really big factor of the way of life here. And when I'm talking about the natural resource curse in West Virginia or anywhere or another country, what I'm basically talking about is the paradox of plenty. It means that countries or states that have an abundance of natural resources, specifically point source resources like fuel or minerals, they tend to have less economic growth and worse development outcomes. And some of the causes and effects from being concentrated in natural resource extraction include weak governance, revenue volatility, less development, crowding out of human capital, otherwise known as Dutch disease, less incentive for education attainment, less economic diversity, and economic instability, a boom and bust economy. Does that sound very familiar here in West Virginia at all? A lot of it is. So there's a lot of research on this going back, back to even the 50s and 60s and up through Jeffrey Sachs did some pioneering work looking at other countries and especially Africa. But there's over the last 2 decades, there's been some pretty good work. Actually, it was a great paper done by an economist at WVU, Stratford Douglas. He looked at coal mining counties all through Appalachia. He said, according to his study, there is a resource curse, that increasing in mining employment does negatively impact their per capita income growth. These are just a list of other studies. But this diagram is actually from Mark Partridge, who's an economist at the Ohio University. He just sort of looks at resource abundance. It tends to be sort of low employment skills and higher wages. This causes an incentive gap. And then incentive gap causes a lack of human capital. So you have an undiversified economy because you're pushing out, that's the Dutch disease. Then you end up having an innovation gap because you have a lack of competitive capital, and that causes poor economic growth. And then back to the specialization trap. Now things have changed. That's the whole point of this lecture, is that we're not deep into coal mining exactly like we were before. We went from 120,000 to roughly 12,000 employed today. So it's very different. And we are trying to understand the impact of shale drilling too. What's the impact going to be? We talk about legacy costs of mining. We know in a free market system that these should be borne by those that cause them. Obviously that's not happening, because if we had to actually pay for the externality costs, they wouldn't happen in the first place unless they can push that social cost on everybody else. So studies have been somewhat over the board on resource curse. Some studies have found zero effect. I was driving through Campbell County, Wyoming last year. Median income in Campbell County, the biggest coal producing county, is about $82,000 a year. That's pretty high. West Virginia, about half that. So there's
What
different
county?
Campbell County, Wyoming.
Wyoming.
Yes. So, I mean, there are different areas that do better, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the studies can be all over this. Most of the studies have found in the past that there is evidence of a resource curse among U.S. states that concentrate in coal mining. At least when you're looking today, when you look at shale drilling, some studies are finding the same things. They're finding that there's jobs, but somehow there's not income. And that's because a lot of the jobs are not being taken by people that are in the area. We'll talk a little bit about that. But, overall, it's too early to sort of tell exactly where we are going to be on that. But I would say in West Virginia, there's a great quote from Ron Eller, if everybody's read miners, mill hands, and mountaineers, which everybody should if they haven't. But he says a quote from his book I always liked. He said, without local, this is about Central Appalachia in general, mostly I think he's talking about West Virginia and Kentucky. But he said, without local and regional markets, the economic structure of the mountains was solely dependent upon exterior demand. The condition of growth without development placed the mountains in a highly vulnerable relationship to the larger market system. Despite the vast natural resources within its borders, the southern mountains remained comparatively poor, not because it was backward, but because its wealth enriched the modernizing centers in other parts of the country. You can feel a lot of that today here in West Virginia. We're doing that right now. We just did an analysis a little bit earlier, we're doing a report later, but over 90% of all coal in West Virginia, if you include electricity, is exported out of the state. And you do natural gas, it's over that. So we look at who's benefiting, where is that going? Is it feeding our big population centers here in West Virginia? No, because we don't have any. And that's something that is probably at the root of West Virginia's low economic development, is the fact that we don't have big population centers. And that lack of, we're really spread out. And that's a huge factor in that. So that's kind of the research, but so the question is, well, how is West Virginia doing? One thing we did in a report a while back was sort of look at our boom and bust economy, and this is just descriptive statistics. We're not controlling for anything, any type of regression or anything. We're just looking at growth in West Virginia. What we found is, over the long term, those that concentrate in mining, the counties that have the highest share of mining employment, tend to do worse over time. They do better, so during the boom times, they tend to do worse over the long term. So what this looks is the difference between the growth rates between the West Virginia as a whole and the mining counties that concentrate in mining. So in the 70s boom, those places did really well because of the OPEC crisis and things like that in West Virginia. So those mining, especially the steel industry, was really pumping in the mid-70s. That all came to a crashing halt in the 80s. It was a double dip in steel and coal production, along with mechanization again. In the 90s, we had broader growth, and those mining areas did worse. You know, in the year 2000, we only had about 14,000 coal mining. That's how many were employed. And then, you know, people were making a big deal about going from 25 to 22 or something, but, you know, if you go back to the 2000, we were only about 14,000. In the 2000s was another energy boom. Simultaneously, we saw an increase in the price of coal, and that fueled it. But what's the irony in all of that is we got a lot more jobs out of that because, and our productivity drained. It started lowering dramatically because we're actually, we had thinner seams and we had high price for coal and a lot more coal miners. And that eventually put us out of competition with places like out west, like the Powder River Basin. So when that came crashing down, along with the energy prices for natural gas expectedly, those counties that concentrated mining did relatively worse. They actually saw a population loss. When we just look at the counties that concentrate in natural gas development, we're finding a similar story happen. So if we look pre-Marcellus boom, 2006 to 2010, some measures they were doing a little bit better on employment, but by and large, those counties that concentrated in drilling were doing worse. Take the Marcellus boom, which is basically 2010 to 2014, and by boom, I'm talking about price and production, because production is at an all-time high. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We're at about 1.4 trillion cubic feet last year. That's more than we ever had. It's interesting how the price dropped way more than half, and we still produce as much. It shows that you can really boost that severance tax if you're interested. And so recently we've had a real natural gas bust, right? So a couple years ago we only collected about $44 million in natural gas severance taxes. Next year we're looking at $160 million. The previous year before $44 million we collected over $120 million. So when that price of gas drops, because our severance tax is based on the wellhead price, we see a huge impact on our budget. We also saw a huge impact in some of the counties. The total earnings, personal income, and employment were lower in those counties. Population was about the same.
Wait a minute, are these variations of 1%?
No, so let's take the 0%.
That seems like a tiny amount.
No, what we're looking at is the difference in growth rates between the average in West Virginia. So if the average job growth was, let's say it was 5%, okay, and let's say the average growth in mining counties was 2.5%. That would be a negative 2.5%.
So it subtracts from the, or
Yes.
adds to.
It's the difference between the state average and the counties that concentrate in this one, it's the counties that concentrate in shale drilling. Sorry if that was confusing for folks.
No, sorry.
No, that's good. I probably didn't preface that.
I was trying to understand that figure, that 1.1%.
Yeah, so if you look at that employment figure, so during the Marcellus boom, the growth, the annual employment growth in those counties was 1.1% higher than it was in the state as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 1.1%, but as a objective number, like one place would be 2% growth and one place would be 3.1.
Yeah.
That, it's not like 1%
No.
of
It's
the
actually, yeah.
other factor.
Yeah,
Okay.
you got it. So anyway, what we're seeing is that happening again in West Virginia too, in other counties as well. And just sort of looking at specific counties, these are the biggest gas producing counties in West Virginia. You have Marshall, Tyler, Harrison, Wetzel, Doddridge, and Ritchie. Those are the biggest in the last year that we have. And if you look over the last, from 2004 to 2006, that's the latest we have annual data for, you saw that during that bust, they produced about $4.8 billion worth of natural gas, and when they lost about over 1,500 jobs. And one thing that we found in West Virginia, like there was a press release the governor put out and said, hey, we're the top of the country in GDP growth. Anybody see that? Economic growth. Well, we can have growth. Back to what we were talking about. We have growth. We don't have development. And you don't have jobs. Because you have GDP growth doesn't mean you have jobs. And the reason for that is, coal is a little bit actually less capital intensive than gas is. Gas is so capital intensive, you produce such a high ratio of GDP per worker that you don't get the employment effects. You guys follow that? I mean, that's what really happens. We can have really great growth, huge GDP growth, going 3-4% a year, or actually the last couple of years about 5%. And we had negative job growth, negative. We were last, over the last 2 years, we were last in job growth, 6th in GDP growth, and we were 35th in income growth. So there's a huge disconnect between what we're producing, our output as a state, and how many are employed and how much income is flowing into the state. Just to close with some just observations and some hopes of the future. Overall, the literature pretty much shows that boom and bust economies are not conducive. Most businesses, because of the instability of energy prices and waning production, it causes it not to be a good place to have economic development. We talked about earlier, the shale industry is very capital intensive. So therefore, when we're looking at tax incentives for gas, it's kind of ass backwards because there's really no need to do that. There's a bill that we were talking about earlier that has that, that's doing that. Better governance is probably one of the biggest issues that we're finding with the resource curse that everybody's found throughout countries and here. And that we can mitigate some of those problems. One of the biggest things to ensure when we look at coal's past and where we are today is to ensure that we look at those negative externalities, that we make sure they're paid by the industry. And it's really hard to tell, like in the future, 20 years from now, what are going to be those huge legacy costs of all the shale drilling that's happening in West Virginia. One thing that we've talked about at the center that other states have done too is to use that natural gas severance tax effectively. And I would argue some states have done better than others, but to use that as dedicated to a permanent severance tax trust fund. People are pretty familiar with the Alaska Permanent Fund, but other states have them as well. Louisiana actually just passed one. Alaska has about $61.5 billion in their mineral trust fund, but other states like Texas, Wyoming, New Mexico, North Dakota, Alabama, there's Louisiana's, and Montana all have permanent mineral trust funds. And there's a reason they do this, and this is to be able to create a permanent source of wealth from a finite source of resources. So imagine in the 70s, we said, we should take 3 or 4% of that severance tax, back then it was a gross receipts tax, and put it into a fund to ensure when there are bad times or there are good times, we can use that. And that's how these states do this. They use the revenue that grows from the investment of their funds to fund things in their state. Wyoming used part of their severance tax to give some students free tuition. There's some states that do very innovative things with those. But in order for us to really get through this and to look at the future and how we're going to be able to develop through it, we are going to have to take that. And it is kind of like when I talk to my friends in New England, they're always like, well, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. But I think it is possible to use that severance tax revenue and invest it in infrastructure, human and physical capital, and to diversify our economy. We have unsuccessfully done that, and I think it is at the root of the problem. We've never fixed it in West Virginia, and I think if we're going to be able to do that, you're going to have to do that. Of course, this all ignores the fact that we might be headed toward disaster with climate change, moving that to the side. The end of human organized existence might be happening, but we will use what we can from it. No, but those things are going to have to, these are just common sense things that we know what to do. I think it's important for people to understand that these are options, that the reason that we haven't been able to do these are policy choices. These are political choices. We could have made things a lot better, but we didn't. And I think going forward, we're going to have to, or we're going to end up, because the trajectory of our state right now, when you look at population growth and everything else, it's not good. So hopefully we can turn that around, but one way would be to do something like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
1 minute.
Let's take a few minutes for questions. Questions from the audience first. Go ahead, John.
How much of a severance tax would you recommend that be implemented, that you think is politically feasible and would be a meaningful start, and then how should it alter over time? On natural gas.
Yeah, politically feasible right now, 0. You know, I mean, I'm just being honest. I mean, I think they're trying to actually increase the natural gas tax 2.5% from its current 5% to fund PIA.
Say it again?
So they're trying to raise it, the Democrats in the legislature are, to fund PEIA, part of that.
But that's not the fund you're talking about.
No. I mean, I think you know, we did pass the West Virginia Future Fund. Unfortunately, there were a lot of triggers in the legislation that prohibit any money going into the fund.
Leaving the political
Yeah.
obstacles somewhat aside,
All right.
what would you recommend?
Oh, I would recommend, I think you could at least go up to 20-30%.
20 to 30%, and how much would that be?
Well, we're going to be hitting about 164 million at 5%.
Pardon me?
So at 5%, that's the statutory rate, not the effective. It's about 164 million next year is what they're projecting. And the reason I say that is because if you look at natural gas prices, let's go back. I have a great slide. I didn't include it in this, but if you go back to you know, a couple years ago, we were producing about, for every million cubic feet, the total value was a little over $8,000, okay? That's when production was about 250 billion cubic feet. Moving forward to today, we're producing about $1,000 for every million cubic feet. So they went from 8,000 to 1,000, and we're producing from 250 billion to 1.4 trillion cubic feet. So we've 5-fold increase in our production while the price completely plummeted. That tells you there's just a traumatic amount of room for a severance tax in there. And that's the thing we haven't been able to really fix in our state, I think.
So if I was to say, how much, somebody should ask me, what's a good severance tax? I'd say, well, Ted said 25% would be good.
Sure.
Is that right? Okay.
There's no evidence that it wouldn't be.
Consider yourself an authority. Thank you.
Yeah.
You've sort of hinted at this notion of third world despotic governments and the ways that they get themselves in these very similar situations. And it strikes me that that's a pretty good analogy. It's just a little distressing because most of those examples have historically, for decades and centuries, have not found a way to get out from underneath multinational corporations moving in and sort of raping the land and running away and leaving anything of lasting value behind. I'm not sure there's a question that's baked into this. I just wonder where some traction might be able to be applied, and I'm just not seeing a very clear window or vision for improvements for some of these issues.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. I mean, I went and watched Black Panther. Everybody seen that movie yet? We're not Wakanda, you know. But yeah, I think coal has left the station in terms of trying to really figure that out. I mean, people did land studies. People did a whole host of things to tax reserves. There was huge lawsuits over it. I mean, it's been a whole stream of people trying to do that for a very long time on coal, and I think that has sort of left the station. When it comes to natural gas, and one thing that's very unique about West Virginia, these are all private, this is private property. You go out west, it's all public. There's a lot more control over it. Not a lot, some more. They also get a royalty rate, the severance tax. It looked like in Wyoming, you get about 25% of the value of the product in Wyoming if it's on federal land. So it's just a very different thing. But I think the trajectory going forward and trying to do that is really just a political question, whether people can democratically take meaningful control over the process to impact change. But if the past is any source of understanding, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do that. And gas is just a very different beast than coal was. Coal was very vertically integrated when it began here, and gas is just same sort of similar issue, but you have different mineral and land ownership patterns when you're looking at natural gas that are different. Some people are making money that were able to get a royalty rate from gas. It's different, but doesn't look good in terms of promising. But I think the control of these industries on our politics is a very large concern, because there used to be an old joke in West Virginia, we have two parties, you have the left and the right of the coal party. And I think, becoming the COG, the coal, oil, and gas party. But I think it needs to happen, but it's going to be pretty difficult.
Yes.
You mentioned a one-dimensional economy and low human capital with these kind of industries. What's your opinion on the $83 billion China MOU about to be?
I'd like to see it.
Do you need to capitalize on the severance tax?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing the legislature is looking at doing is getting rid of the industrial personal property tax, which would be a huge source if that actually transpired and we had all this huge capital investment. We wouldn't get much tax revenue out of it if we're not taxing the personal property of that industry. So there's pretty close to maybe passing that. I would be very skeptical of that. I would say one thing people don't realize too, the best economic thing that's happened in West Virginia over the last 5 years has been Medicaid expansion. People don't talk, it's $1 billion a year. Anybody else bringing $1 billion a year to West Virginia in federal money? I mean, like, that single instance has, provides a lot of jobs, and that's, and I think they backtracked a little bit from that. I remember, I think Justice said, well, even if it's not 87, it might be 1 billion, so what, It's hard to tell with the, but I think it is interesting, that's a state-owned enterprise, the Energy Corporation, so it's not exactly, yeah, I'll believe that when I see it.
John.
How high could the severance tax go before it was such a disincentive to production that the gas companies would quit?
Yeah, so there is if you're looking to do a dissertation for a university, I'm a wonky guy, but severance tax is a very not looked at, well-studied tax. Shelby Gerkling, who's a scholar at the University of Central Florida, is one of the only people I know that has actually looked at it. And he got fired from his job at the University of Wyoming for basically telling them that all you're going to do is lose money if you lower the severance tax. He did a very big report in 2000. It is a marginal gain. One thing that's not talked about in the law is bankruptcy law. You want to talk about antithetical to all free market principles, like nothing free market about letting big companies. They are leveraged to the gills. I mean, and their whole model depends on it. And it is difficult to understand at what point, that can happen. But if somebody says, if you increase the severance tax and we won't drill as much, fine. I say yes, fine. One, for environmental reasons. But the second reason is when the price goes up, you will. You absolutely will drill it at some point if policy sort of stays the same that way. And I've never seen any state who raises severance tax lose money. But at the actual rate, like I said, the price of gas dropped by over $3. So from 4 to 1, If that can happen, just think of the margins of that, and they're producing 1.4 trillion cubic feet, when before they were producing, maybe making money off what they were before. So I think you have a long way to go. Other countries like Norway tax it 60, 70%. Alaska's tax is, unfortunately, they can deduct their expenses, which has led to a negative severance tax in Alaska. But when it was at its boom, when they, before they could do that, their effective rate was well over about 12.5%, if memory serves correct. And people were yelling, drill, baby, drill, right? That's huge, twice as big a rate than ours. But I think it's a very good academic question. But I have a pretty good feeling that we're nowhere close to the margins that would impact. These are deductible on their federal income taxes. Nobody brings that up in tax law all the time. Like, companies can deduct their business expenses, and state and local taxes are one of those. So a third, now I guess now 22% of that cost could be deductible. But I really don't have like a, exact answer.
We're out of time.
Yeah. Like
Professor McGinley, why don't you take a quick word?
Yeah, listening to what everyone has said here today, and there are a lot of dreams. The reality is, it's grim, and unless there's political change and activism to change the decision makers in state and federal government. What Brandon is doing is great, but it's, how many jobs do you?
100.
100 jobs. What's the unemployment rate? We're talking about tens of thousands, right?
Yeah.
The trust fund that Ted talks about, terrific idea. What did he say? No chance, zero chance. The history of regulation, going back a century, is, if we can not regulate, if we can let them externalize as much as possible, your black lung, your water pollution, your air pollution, your climate change, that's what happens. And it's especially grim in this state. It's a depressing thought to leave here, but
well, we're not going to.
There are really good minds. There's a lot of energy. We've got to get out and do something about it.
And that leads me to my final comment, which is there are a lot of students in the room, and I beg you and I plead with you to take what you've learned here this afternoon out into the world of your practice and make this a better state. Thank you very much for coming.